Well, here we are. Monday, October 24th, 2022. I'm Larissa. Today we are going to start reading my favorite work of fiction of all time. To a God Unknown. What is my second favorite work of fiction of all time? I think it's Light in August by William Faulkner. I do. What else? Old Man and the Sea, Hemingway. Love, love, love it. What else? Joyce Carol Oates, Foxfire Girls. Love it. Margaret Atwood, Oryx and Crake. Might have to read Oryx and Crake. Might have to read Light in August. What else? Toni Morrison, Sula. Sula is very good. Toni Morrison, Song of Solomon. Very good. What else? Well, of course, Camus, The Stranger. I guess we should talk about American fiction and fiction that is not American. Very different things, aren't they? Very, 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 very different things. Might have to read some Solzhenitsyn. Might have to. Might have to read some Solzhenitsyn. Anyway. John Steinbeck, To a God Unknown. Born in Salinas, California in 1902, John Steinbeck grew up in a fertile agricultural valley about 25 miles from the Pacific coast, and both valley and coast would serve as settings for some of his best fiction. In 1919, he went to Stanford University, where he intermittently enrolled in literature and writing courses until he left in 1925 without taking a degree. During the next 5 years, he supported himself as a laborer and journalist in New York City, and then as a caretaker for a Lake Tahoe estate, all the time working on his first novel, Cup of Gold, 1929. After marriage and a move to Pacific Grove, he published 2 California fictions, The Pastures of Heaven, 1932, and To a God Unknown, 1933, and worked on short stories collected in the Long Valley, 1938. Popular success and financial security came only with Tortilla Flat in 1935, stories about Monterey's paisanos. A ceaseless experimenter throughout his career, Steinbeck changed courses regularly. 3 powerful novels of the late 1930s focused on the California laboring class in Dubious Battle, 1936, Of Mice and Men, 1937, and the book considered by many his finest, The Grapes of Wrath, 1939. Early in the 1940s, Steinbeck became a filmmaker with The Forgotten Village, 1941, and a serious student of marine biology with Sea of Cortez in 1941. He devoted his services to the war, writing Bombs Away, 1942, and the controversial play novelette, The Moon is Down, 1942. He was commissioned by the U.S. federal government to write that piece. Cannery Row, 1945, The Wayward Bus, 1947, The Pearl, 1947, A Russian Journal, 1948, another experimental drama, Burning Bright, 1950, and The Log from the Sea of Cortez, 1951, preceded publication of the monumental East of Eden, 1952, an ambiguous saga of the Salinas Valley and his own family's history. The last decades of his life were spent in New York City and Sag Harbor with his third wife, with whom he traveled widely. Later books include Sweet Thursday, 1954, The Short Reign of Pippin IV, A Fabrication, 1957, Once There Was a War, 1958, The Winter of Our Discontent, 1961, Travels with Charlie in Search of America, 1962, America and Americans, 1966, and the posthumously published journal of a novel, The East of Eden Letters, 1969, Viva Zapata, 1975, The Acts of King Arthur and His Noble Knights, 1976, and Working Days, The Journals of the Grapes of Wrath, 1989. He died in 1968, having won a Nobel Prize in 1962. Robert Dumont is a professor of English at Ohio University, where he teaches American literature and has received both graduate and undergraduate teaching awards. His books include Steinbeck's Reading, 1984, and the forthcoming Steinbeck's Typewriter, Essays on creative dimensions of his art. He edited Steinbeck's Working Days, The Journals of the Grapes of Wrath, 1989, and co-edited Steinbeck's novels and stories, 1932 through 37, for the Library of America in 1994. To a God Unknown by John Steinbeck, with an introduction and notes by Robert DeMott. Penguin Books. Introduction. Primus ego in partem mecum, dediceum musas, for I shall be the first, if I live, to bring the muse into my country. This was not a boast, but a hope, at once bold and devoutly humble, that he might bring the muse to his own little country. Jim Burden, on Virgil's Gorgias, in Willa Cather, My Antonia, 1918. I never read that. This story has grown since I started it. From a novel about people, it has become a novel about the world. The new eye is being opened here in the West, the new seeing. John Steinbeck, in a 1932 journal. I, Roman numeral I. In the margin of an older sister's copy of Robert Louis Stevenson's Prince Otto, a very young John Steinbeck marked in pencil his intention to be a writer. It was startling because, as Steinbeck later claimed in an early draft to a God Unknown, artists and poets were not much thought of in Western America. But at that time, when the definition of writer seemed less ambiguous and contested, but no less fraught with dilemma, than it has become in our post-structuralist age, Steinbeck's desire would become a self-fulfilling prophecy, which he addressed with such undeflected intensity for the rest of his life that he often considered himself monomaniacal. When there is no writing, I feel like an uninhabited body, he remarked in 1931. He belonged to a turn-of-the-century generation of white male novelists for whom the act of writing would be considered an essential, even exalted pursuit. William Faulkner and Ernest Hemingway were his contemporaries. Born within 4 years of each other, all three eventually won the Nobel Prize for Literature. For Steinbeck, as with many modern-era writers, literary creativity took precedence over nearly all other life endeavors. He reached maturity in a period when becoming an author was a self-willed act with a romantic, rebellious aura to it. Consequently, 2 of his first 3 books, Cup of Gold, To a God Unknown, featured larger-than-life heroes. More than that, however, throughout Steinbeck's life, writing was all things to him, a purely enjoyable activity, a sustaining addiction, a way of establishing and maintaining personal and economic identity, and perhaps, most of all, a habit of being, a necessary condition of existence. As long as I can eat and write more books, that's all I require, he stated in November 1933. Though occasionally he played the role of artist with capital A, Steinbeck was more often than not extremely humble and self-deprecating. He learned early to distrust and even eschew the glamorous celebrity side of authorship, with its emphasis on publicity and fame, and instead focused his energy on its private workday side. If living so deeply in his fiction made him less than fully comfortable in the social, domestic, and emotional spheres of real life, it also provided therapeutic, compensatory benefits for a man who was intensely shy and inward-looking. Novels regulate our lives and give us a responsibility, he claimed in 1930. 5 years later, having tested his first critical and commercial success with his 4th novel, Tortilla Flat, he confessed to the San Francisco Chronicle's book critic, Joseph Henry Jackson, "The work has been the means of making me feel that I am living richly, diversely, and in a few cases and for a few moments, even heroically. All of these things are not me, for I am none of these things, but sometimes in my own mind, at least I can create something which is larger and richer than I am." More than 2 decades later, Steinbeck was still espousing the priority of his life in art. He counseled Dennis Murphy, a young novelist and family friend, that work is your only weapon against life's tragedies. John Ernst Steinbeck was born into a respected middle-class household in Salinas, California on February 27, 1902. He was the third of 4 children of John Ernst Steinbeck, 1862 to 1935, a quiet, emotionally distant man who was, until 1911, manager of the Sperry Flour Mill, then became a private tradesman with his own feed and grain store, which failed, a bookkeeper at the Spreckels Sugar Refinery, and, in 1926, elected treasurer of Monterey County. Steinbeck's mother, Olive Hamilton Steinbeck, 1867 to 1934, was an energetic, formidable, and socially active former schoolteacher who encouraged Steinbeck's intellectual habits and fostered his sense of privilege at being the only son among the 4 children. His bookish side, however, was colored by a sensitivity passed down from the Hamiltons toward ghostly apparitions and paranormal reality. Throughout Steinbeck's work, beginning with Cup of Gold, detachment exists side by side with an attraction for archetypes, visionary experiences, and mythic patterns. The great live oak, under which Joseph Wayne, the protagonist of To a God Unknown, builds his house, has its counterpart in a brother pine tree, the young Steinbeck planted next to the family's Monterey Bay summer cottage on 11th Avenue in Pacific Grove. "If the tree should die, I am pretty sure I should be ill," he claimed in 1930. Steinbeck's parents were proper civic-minded citizens in Salinas, a predominantly conservative agricultural community towards which Steinbeck exhibited antipathy for most of his adult life. Writing was his ticket out of town. Though once gone, he remained in close contact with his family. Like Joseph Wayne, Steinbeck always chafed between the desire to be at home and the need to be independent and court adventure. Metaphorically speaking, writing fulfilled both urges. His father hoped Steinbeck would do something suitably practical with his life, such as being an engineer or lawyer, but accepted his son's ruthless decision to become a writer. Beginning sporadically in 1929, he allowed John, and after August 1930, and continuing for most of the next 5 years, John and his wife Carol, to occupy rent-free the family's 3-room Pacific Grove cottage, and also provided a $25 monthly living allowance so that his son could concentrate solely on writing daily. From that time on, Steinbeck never held an outside job. Working in words became his profession and vocation. Steinbeck's mother, never quite satisfied with her son's radical decision, hoped that, if he became a novelist at all, he would be like the successful Booth Tarkington. Well into his 20s, Steinbeck was still influenced by the flabby sensibility and worldly excesses of Don Byrne and James Branch Cabell. Fortunately, however, besides devouring the Bible and Sir Thomas Malory's Morte d'Arthur, Steinbeck also read widely in translations of ancient classics, notably by Aeschylus, Herodotus, Homer, and Virgil, in modern American and world literature, philosophy, history, science, anthropology, and mythology. His acquaintance begun in 1930 with Edward F. Ricketts, a philosophical marine biologist at whose Pacific Biological Laboratory on Ocean View Avenue in Monterey, Steinbeck spent countless hours of discussion and debate, would by the early 1930s curb the mawkishness in his writing and enlarge his view of fictional taste and artistic propriety. In 1932, urged by a friend to read Oswald Spengler's The Decline of the West, Steinbeck pursued the first chapter, then returned the book, claiming he could not read it because it would kill his art. Despite frequent lapses of self-confidence on his way to becoming a full-fledged novelist, Steinbeck relied upon little more than enormous dedication and commitment, unflagging endurance and independence, strong convictions, sincere intentions, an honest desire to improve, and a blistering capacity for self-criticism. To these aspects of his talent, he was fortunate to add the support of his family and the generosity and goodwill of several trustworthy friends. After graduating from Salinas High School in June 1919, Steinbeck entered Stanford University and attended classes for a total of 6 semesters through June 1925 without earning a degree. His nominal major was English. In 11 of his 14 English department courses, which included journalism, Steinbeck's grades ranged from D to B+. His only 3 A's were in courses where more than the usual amount of imagination was called for: versification, feature article writing, and especially short story writing, which he took twice, the first time earning a B. More importantly, Edith Ronald Murley, Steinbeck's creative writing professor in English 136, instilled in him an extraordinary and lifelong awareness that there was no magical formula, no secret ingredient for writing effective fiction except experience, the desire to communicate, reverence for precise language, a terse, lean style, and plenty of discipline and humility. Some of these elements were in lesser supply than others in Steinbeck's brash juvenile period, when he managed only 2 stories in Stanford's literary magazine in 1924 and another, The Gifts of Ivan by John Stern, The Smoker's Companion in 1927. Throughout the 20s, in a succession of odd jobs in California and New York as a surveyor, day laborer, carpenter's helper, bench chemist, ship's steward, journalist, and fish hatchery attendant, Steinbeck built a reservoir of practical experience which he would draw upon for the rest of his life, and continued writing stories and submitting them for publication, but without success. In 1927 to 28, seeking solitude to devote himself seriously to writing, he wintered at Lake Tahoe as an estate caretaker, and began reworking The Lady in Infrared, a story he had written at Stanford. The result was his first novel, Cup of Gold, a historical work set in Wales and Panama about the 17th century pirate Henry Morgan. It was published in August 1929 by the New York firm Robert M. McBride, which also optioned his next books. Steinbeck considered Cup of Gold an immature experiment necessary to purge a beginning novelist's enthusiasms and to sweep all the cabello burnyish perniciousness out for good. Preciousness, not perniciousness. Preciousness. And perniciousness didn't make sense. As Steinbeck was soon to discover, however, Cup of Gold's publication guaranteed nothing as far as mastery of his art was concerned. It was an awful lot of work to write a novel, he reported to a Grove Day, a Stanford classmate, in late 1929. From 1929 through 1934, when Steinbeck was struggling to establish confidence and credibility and trying to perfect a tighter style, he wrote constantly, but with mixed success. More often than not, he wrote only for himself, but at other times he labored with an eye on the marketplace, such as it was in the early stages of the Depression. Besides Cup of Gold, he published 2 other books of fiction, a linked collection of stories, Pastures of Heaven, 1932, and To a God Unknown, and he published several stories that would later become part of his classical tale of childhood, The Red Pony. So good. And others, The Chrysanthemums, among them, would make up The Long Valley in 1938. Under the stress of his parents' illness in 1939 and 1934, he wrote a large portion of Tortilla Flat. He also wrote other long fictions during that 5-year stretch, including Dissonant Symphony, which he destroyed, and Murder at Full Moon, a shameless commercial satire of pulp detective novels, written under a pseudonym, Peter Pym, named for a character in Edgar Allan Poe's narrative of author Gordon Pym, which was never published. During his apprenticeship period, alternately dejected and elated by his progress and sometimes living hand-to-mouth, Steinbeck tried out different methods, forms, and styles, but never wavered from his purpose. Fine artistic things seem always to be done in the face of difficulties. The rocky soil which seems to give the finest flower is contempt. Don't fool yourself, he informed fellow novelist George Albee in 1931. Appreciation doesn't make artists, it ruins them. A man's best work is done when he is fighting to make himself heard, not when swooning audiences wait for his paragraphs. Until Tortilla Flat succeeded commercially in 1935, Steinbeck earned less than $1,000 from publications. With The Pastures of Heaven and To a God Unknown, he was on his way toward establishing a new fictional voice in California. Like Virgil, whose gorgeous Steinbeck admired, he too hoped, against great personal and cultural odds, to be the first of his generation to bring the muse into my country. In the wake of such politicized, socially conscious novels as In Dubious Battle, 1936, Of Mice and Men, 1937, and The Grapes of Wrath, 1939, John Steinbeck has come to be regarded as one of America's foremost documentary stylists. But the truth is that, in a career spanning nearly 40 years, during which he wrote 30 books of fiction, drama, nonfiction, he was never fully comfortable with or in control of a strictly realistic mode. Like Pilon, a character in his comic Tortilla Flat, the curse of realism lay uneasily on Steinbeck. Even The Grapes of Wrath, his most important fictional achievement, was arguably one of the world's greatest novels, owes as much to the mythopoeic legacy of 19th century American Romanticism and to the experimental techniques of modernist cinema as it does to the rigorous process of conducting field research among California's Dust Bowl migrants, upon which Steinbeck built his convincing vision. It is worth recalling Steinbeck's early admission to his Stanford classmates and fellow novelist Carl Williamson. To a God Unknown, he announced, leaves realism farther and farther behind. I never had much I never had much ability for, nor faith, nor belief in realism. Realism is, he added, just another form of fantasy. For Steinbeck, all modes of discourse, all enabling theories of writing, were equally fictive. Objectivity, which he adopted as a technical strategy, created narrative distance and control, which allowed him to establish irony and or ambiguity. Like so many other American novelists who had an anxious, even subversive relationship with literary realism, Mark Twain, Willa Cather, and William Faulkner are three he explicitly admired, Steinbeck, oh, I love Mark Twain too, Steinbeck always distrusted its naive veneer. So he redefined realism for his own purposes, made it up as he went, so to speak, and consistently nudged his readers behind or beyond the exterior face of reality to the contextual and constitutive factors, whether biological, economic, social, historical, emotional, mythical, or psychological, that impinge on the way his fictional human beings act. He built a wall of background, as he later called it. The profound and dark and strong, libidinous streams of the unconscious in every human being had become the locus of his interests, he admitted to Wilhelm in August 1933. The pastures of heaven and to a God unknown, Steinbeck defined reality to include seen and unseen, physical and metaphysical, quotidian and psychological elements. His characters follow a trail of innumerable meanings toward what Joseph Wayne tells his wife is the undistorted real, the alluring reality behind reality. This novel, then, inscribes a related web in which the conscious life is affected by the unconscious, and the literal denotive properties of language are interpenetrated by symbolic connotative values. Steinbeck's goal, writes his biographer Jackson Benson, was to make people see the whole as it really is. By striking through outward masks, of course, Steinbeck also frequently bent the formal rules of realistic writing. In a loose sense, all his fiction, even the most naturalistic, has an allegorical dimension and can be considered fabular. His propensity for writing parables has ensured Steinbeck's popular success, but has hurt his reputation in the highest reaches of the critical academy. Parables and fables, the argument goes, are not serious art. His favorite metaphoric gambit was to choose a microcosm to represent the drama of the world, the fruit orchard in Dubious Battle, the bunkhouse in Of Mice of Men, the Joad family's Hudson's Super Six in The Grapes of Wrath, and the pre-World War II industrial cannery section of Monterey's Ocean View Avenue and Cannery Row, are perhaps his foremost recognizable examples of contested sites. But Steinbeck also saw a macrocosm represented in the geographical space of his native country, California's Monterey County, and especially in his home turf, the Salinas Valley. This entire region, which takes on a distinct life of its own in his fiction, was his equivalent of Faulkner's fictional Yakanapatawa County in Mississippi. I'm sorry if I butchered that. I'm sure I did. And the rugged Carmel Big Sur landscape of neighbor Robinson Jeffers' poems. From an early stage of his career, Steinbeck exhibited a special affinity with, and, like Joseph Wayne, an enormous hunger toward this unique part of his native state. In 1933, Steinbeck told Albee, "I think I would like to write the story of this whole valley, of all the little towns and all the farms and the ranches and the wider hills. I can see how I would like to do it so that it would be the valley of the world." Steinbeck's gaze covered an area from Santa Cruz and Watsonville on the north to King City and Jolin on the south. Westward, Steinbeck's country was bounded by the Pacific Ocean and the Santa Lucia Mountains, and to the east by the Gabilan Mountains. That slice of Northern California is now popularly known as Steinbeck County, or Steinbeck Country. Oh, sorry, my nose is itching. Steinbeck's hunger, his compulsion to tell the significant stories of people situated in and on, but not apart from, this land, became one of his recognizable signatures as a novelist. In a 1932 journal addressed privately to former Stanford roommate and close friend Carlton Duke Sheffield, Steinbeck noted of To a God Unknown, "The story is a parable, Duke, the story of a race, growth, and death. Each figure is a population, and the stones, the trees, the muscled mountains are the world. but not the world apart from man, the world and man, the one indescribable unit, man plus his environment, chronicling the lives of people in the valley of the world in such a way that they would be more than mere regional oddities, and so that they would represent an embedded part of the environment out of which they came, was Steinbeck's special achievement in the pastures of heaven. In the stories of the Long Valley, including the Red Pony, and of course in To a God Unknown, particularly in chapter 21, where Steinbeck's ecological posture reaches a visionary level as he metamorphosizes Joseph Wayne's body as a landmass, a world brain, with the power to destroy environmental order on a whim. Philosopher John Elof Boudin's axiom that the laws of thought must be the laws of things, one of Steinbeck's favorite quotations, has special resonance here and underscores the novelist's view on the human body as text, the text as body, on which are written the defining struggles of desire, as well as the intricate difficulties of representation. When reading this unusual novel, then, with its oddly unsettling and sometimes strained combination of Christian and pagan, sacred and profane attributes, its earthiness and surreality, violence and pastoralism, pantheism and anthropomorphism, naturalism and lyricism, it is helpful to remember that Steinbeck invested his essential self in it, which is to say, he wrote it more like an extensive poem or extended dream sequence than a traditionally mimetic or realistic novel. I have the instincts of a minstrel rather than those of a scrivener, he informed Grove Day in late 1929. Thus, while To a God Unknown has an urgent, breathless fairy tale quality, and is, as critic Howard Levent asserts, more a series of detached scenes than a unified, organic whole, it is not an incoherent concoction, a rambling and improbable history, as Warren French calls it, that flies in the face of all sensible literary convention. During its long gestation through different versions and multiple drafts, Steinbeck worked hard to create a palpable factual dimension that gives this otherwise arcane book a recognizable texture in regard to its geographical setting and landmarks, the moss-covered rock that actually exists in the Northern California town of Laytonville, its unusual characteristics, some of whom, such as the seer, Steinbeck claimed, were based on living persons, and in its feel for telling details of nature and social life in Monterey County in the early part of the century. Although Steinbeck is not normally considered an autobiographical writer, the story of Joseph Wayne's pursuit is, up to a certain point, the story of Steinbeck. Both are obsessed with tracing out destinies and with seeking a generative place behind the reality of words and actions. To a God Unknown is driven by a kind of masculine poetics, symbolized by the totemic bull in chapter 6, which thrives on competitiveness and prizes primacy and mastery, but it is also leavened by irony, an employment of a new eye in the West. Steinbeck subverted California's populist image as a carefree golden land by pitilessly exposing its dichotomies, its mysteries, its unattainable felicities, like those twisted madrone trees of chapter 2, whose bright green and shiny leaves appear only at the end of horrible limbs. Steinbeck's imagination and his vision of himself as author were thoroughly implicated in these paradoxical critiques. Indeed, Joseph's drive toward the ineffable functions as a parable of Steinbeck's own struggle with his art, but where Joseph's solipsistic fetish leads him back to the vortex of unconsciousness, which erases presence and the need for language, Steinbeck's expressive fetish thrusts him out of the unconscious toward a self-fashioned place in the vast geography of words. You haven't any place you know until you make one, Steinbeck informed George Albee in 1932, and if you make one, it will be a new one. Forget about the genius and write books. Whatever you write will be you. Oh my goodness. The introduction goes on, and I'm going to take a break from this, and we will read it in 2 parts. So what is he talking about with Steinbeck? When we get to the novel, you'll see why I think it's really important to read this introduction. This book is a painting. This is not a book. We are going to read a painting. Every single word, every single action, everything is intentional and is needed. And it's not that long, right? This novel is a beautiful portrait of California. And I think coming up on this election series, it's important to take a very deep look at our state and why we live here.